All right, tonight is part one of a two-part series that we're going to be covering here in Fresh Start, in which we deal with the topic of the temple, the priesthood, and the authority that people who work and function in the name of God exercise. One of the things that we looked at last week at the close of the week, as we were at the close of our lesson, as we were talking about what Jesus said concerning the church that he established on this earth, is that Jesus made the promise that the gates of hell would not prevail or overcome the gospel and the church that Jesus established. But in LDS teaching, there is a teaching of a great apostasy or a falling away within that first century, shortly after the death of Peter and the other apostles. The LDS teaching is that the true gospel established by Jesus faded from memory and was gone from the earth. And so from the time prior to the end of the first century until the early 19th century with Joseph Smith, the LDS teaching is that there was no authority of God, no true teaching or church based on Jesus in the whole world, that during those many centuries that it was a time of darkness, and God was preparing a time when, according to LDS teaching, the true gospel would be restored, because what was needed was some of the plain and simple truths, plain and precious promises that LDS teaching says had been removed. And then the other essential thing that LDS teaching says that was lost with the death of Peter and the other apostles was the authority of a priesthood power. And in LDS thinking, it is this priesthood power which is unique to the LDS Church, which Joseph Smith claims he had received first from John the Baptist, a lower level of priesthood, and then from Peter, James, and John, a higher level of priesthood. And that because he and the church he established alone have this priesthood power, that makes the LDS Church the only true church on the face of the earth. That's what the LDS teaching is. And so as the LDS teaching goes about that priesthood power, they say that it is a restored priesthood, which was on the earth in the Old Testament era and through the time of Christ, and then was lost, and then had to be restored. And so in this class, what we do the next 2 weeks is examine what the Bible itself says about what the Old Testament priesthood was, what its function was, what its scope and purpose was. Because whenever you think of a restoration, maybe some of you guys restore cars or motorcycles or something like that, how do you go about restoring something to how it was? What do you need to do? You got to break it down, but what is your goal? Know what it was to start with. A restoration has to match the original if it's really a restoration. And so that's why in this class we focus our attention on what the Old Testament says about the function of the priesthood and the various levels, so-called levels of a priesthood. And so as we go through, this is not going to be an expose of the Mormon temple or what is done in there or priesthood secrets or anything like that. What we're going to be doing is looking at what was done in the Old Testament era under the priesthood that God established through Moses. And then next week we will be examining what the New Testament says about the role of a priesthood now that Jesus Christ himself has come. So that's how we are going to approach this issue, and it's because of the claim of a restoration. The loss of something and then the restoration of something and the possession of that something, a priesthood power, being the unique qualification to speak for God. So we're going to have to rewind into an Old Testament mindset and look at the covenant or solemn binding agreement that God made with the people of Israel as he prepared them from being brought out from bondage in Egypt to go into their freedom in the land which God had promised to give to the descendants of Abraham. At the top of your handout, there are 3 questions listed there, and these are what we're going to approach to find an answer for. First of all, what was the purpose and scope of the biblical priesthood and its practices? And we will go through that tonight. Number 2, was there a need for the restoration of the priesthood in any form? And what is the source of authority for present-day preaching of the gospel of Jesus Christ? We will get the answers to those questions next week. So our goal tonight is to look at what was the purpose and scope of the biblical priesthood and what were its practices. When God used Moses to bring the children of Israel out of bondage, they initially traveled as far as a region in the area of Mount Sinai, and it was there that they stopped and encamped. And Moses went up on the mountain, met with God, and God gave Moses the 10 commandments and a whole bunch of other commandments. And as Moses received those commandments and ordinances from God, he then came down the mountain and met with the congregation of Israel. You can read about this event in Exodus chapter 24. And when he came down with the commandments and all of the ordinances that God had outlined for him while he was up on the mountain, beginning with the 10 commandments, Moses said to the people on behalf of God, "Do you agree to this covenant, to this relationship structure that we will have with God?" And the people said, "Yes, all that is written in the law of God, we will do it." And so they went through a formal ceremony called cutting covenant. Now, covenant is a word that isn't used very often anymore in the sense we're going to look at it. I live in a planned residential area that has covenants as far as what kind of shingles you can use, what kind of siding you can have on your house. That's not what we're talking about here. A covenant, biblically, is a solemn, binding agreement between 2 or more parties, and it has, terms within the agreement itself. For instance, this covenant that was being agreed to between God and the people of Israel promised the people that if they kept the laws of God, that he would give them many, many blessings. But if they did not keep the commandments of God, if they disobeyed God, then they would receive the opposite. They would not be blessed, but they would receive curses or consequences for having broken the law. And so that made this type of covenant a conditional agreement. God says, if you do this or that, then, that's not how you spell then, if you do this or that, then I will bless you. But if you do not do those things, then I will bring consequences upon you, curses upon you. So in this agreement, God had a role and the people had a role in keeping the agreement, and there was some part each one had to accomplish. The people's was obedience, God's was blessing. And in Exodus 24, we read about a ceremony that they go through in order to confirm or ratify this agreement. And it involves the sacrifice of animals and collecting the blood from those animals. And then the blood was sprinkled on an altar which had been built there at the foot of Mount Sinai. The altar represents God. But then the blood was also sprinkled on the congregation as they are gathered there. And so that symbolized the 2 parties or groups that were taking place, that were binding into this agreement together. God, symbolized by the altar, and the congregation as the blood was sprinkled on them. And then, as the terms of the contract or the covenant were being read, those laws and commandments, then the blood was sprinkled on the book of the law. So that showed that this is the terms of our contract. In our world, a covenant would be similar to a contract. When you make a solemn, binding legal agreement, and there's responsibilities by each party, and there's terms of the contract, and there's consequence if you don't keep your terms in the contract. That's very similar to what was going on. And the people willingly entered into this conditional relationship with God based on if they obey the law, then God will bless. And if they do not obey the law, then God would bring consequence. And whenever a covenant was formed, even to this day, there's a specific purpose behind the covenant. Nations form treaties. Treaties are a form of covenant. What would be the purpose of a treaty between nations? For instance, we've had lots of strange treaties about arms, about trade agreements. Why do groups make things like that? To keep the peace, to make sure each side is getting what they want, to ensure protection. And so in this covenant, the reason that it was being made, the reason God approached the people and said, this is what I want to have, was really twofold. The first purpose was to make them distinct from the people in the land they were going to. And by that, what I mean is that when they had spent 400 years in Egypt, they were people who were in relationship with God, but they were living in a pagan land where there were many, many, many different kinds of gods. God delivered them from that to bring them into the land He had promised to give them. But in the land where they were going, there were also many other pagan people who worshiped all kinds of different gods. And so God gave them this law so that He could teach them the distinction between profane and holy. Holy is whatever is set aside for God's use. Profane is anything that is not set aside for God's use. So God wanted them to be distinct from the people in the land, recognizing what was profane or unholy from holy. And so that's what the commandments were there to help them distinguish through. And so there were all kinds of commands about their relationship with God. There were all kinds of commands about their relationship with one another and with their neighbors. There were all kinds of civil and ceremonial commands within this covenant. And so the people were agreeing to keep all of those commands and agreements because they wanted the blessing from it. Nowhere in the law that was the basis of these promises was there ever a promise of salvation. There was never a promise of having your sins removed and having relationship with God restored. This was an agreement about living in the land and receiving blessing from God. But it tells us in the New Testament, in Romans chapter 3, verses 19 and 20, that God had a second purpose in making this covenant with the people, a second purpose in giving them the law, because what God knew is that they weren't going to be able to keep all those commands. There were the big 10, and then there were a whole bunch of other commandments for a total of 613 or 614 commandments. And God knew that the people would not be able to keep all those commands. So in the New Testament, it tells us that another purpose in this covenant was to expose sin. Now, in this class, several weeks ago, we studied what happened to God's perfect creation. And what we saw is that beginning with the two first human beings, God had given a command, and the reason God gets to do that, the reason God gets to set the rules is because He's the creator. And we as creatures are accountable to God, and we have to live by His rules, so to speak. And God had given them one command, and after a period of time, we don't know how long, they violated that command. And instead of going God's way, they went their own way. That is the definition of sin. Sin is not being as wicked and evil as you can be. It's going your own way instead of God's way. And when that happened, the Bible tells us that there was a fundamental change in human nature. And it affected every person that was ever born. And that fundamental change is that we all tend to go our own way instead of God's way. And God knows that. But sometimes we don't. We think we're doing okay. We think we're good people. We think that we don't need God. We think that we can establish our lives for ourselves and live independently and pretty much ignore God and His holiness. And so, knowing the human heart as He does, God was setting up a relationship with the people so that they would recognize their need of Him. And so, in the New Testament, it tells us that part of the purpose of the law was to show the people their true nature, that they really couldn't keep God's commands. Have you ever heard anyone say, I try to keep all the 10 commandments? People say that all the time. Nobody has kept the first commandment for 5 minutes. Have no other gods before you. Love Him with all your heart. No one keeps the 10 commandments, but most people really think they do. And so God had given all of these commandments to help people see that they needed to be rescued from the consequence of sin. What's the consequence of sin? Death. But unless you know that you're a sinner, you are not going to be looking for some means of being rescued from the consequence of sin. And so the Bible tells us that that was one of the primary functions of the commands, was to help people know that they need God, that we need His mercy and His forgiveness and His grace, because we can't be obedient on our own. And so along with all of these commands, God provided a means to cover the guilt of broken commandments until the time that God would send the seed of a woman that He had promised. Remember back in the garden in Genesis 3, when sin first entered, God promised that He would send someone that He referred to as the seed of a woman, who would reverse the consequences of sin and death and release us as humans from the penalty of sin. And so what we see in the commandments that God gave Moses are accompanying activities that would help to maintain our relationship with God and cover the guilt of sin until the seed would come, until the one that God would send to remove the consequence of sin and death would arrive. And so along with all of these commands, God provided some people whose specific job within the whole nation of Israel was to handle this problem in their lives. This part of obedience to the law, first of all, knowing what the law is, and then knowing what to do when one has violated the law, because they were all sinners. They were all going to violate the law at some point. So when we think about the law, that's the 10 commandments and all those other commandments, we have to think about it in 4 aspects, because right along with giving them people the law, God also gave them a group of people whose responsibility it would be to teach them the law and then to take the steps necessary to cover the guilt when the law was broken. That was the priesthood. We're going to go into that in depth in just a minute. God also gave them a place where the priest would take the steps necessary to cover guilt. That was the function of the sanctuary. So on your handouts, next to tabernacle/temple, write sanctuary. Sanctuary is a holy dwelling place which was used to house specific activities. So God gave the law, but then He gave the priests who would take the steps necessary to cover the guilt associated with the broken law. He gave the sanctuary, which was the location where the priest would take these steps to cover the guilt of the broken law. And then He described the sacrifices that were the steps to be taken in the sanctuary by the priest to cover the guilt of the broken law. So you see how all 4 of these pieces fit together. We have the law, but they can't keep it. So He gives them a priest who can do what's necessary to cover the guilt of the broken law. Those people are the priests. And He outlines the place where they will perform that service, which is the sanctuary, the holy dwelling place. And the sacrifices are what they offer to cover the guilt of the broken law. So whenever you think of the Mosaic covenant, always remember that it includes all four of these things. They went together from the very beginning because God knew that they couldn't keep the law. He wanted them to know that, to expose their need of Him and forgiveness through the Savior He would send. But He didn't want their sin to keep them separated from Him, so He provided a means of covering the guilt so that they could stay in relationship with Him. He had just delivered them from bondage in Egypt. He didn't want them to be wiped out by plagues or consequences of broken laws, even though they thought they could keep the commands. So He provided this means of covering the guilt that they create by sinning, and that way He could maintain a relationship with them, even though He is a holy God. Their sin would be covered according to the means He provided through these commands, and so they could continue in relationship with God. So, when the people made that agreement that I just described in Exodus chapter 24, when the blood from the sacrificed animals was sprinkled on the altar, which represented God, and it was sprinkled on the congregation of people, representing the second party in the agreement, and then on the written commands, which are the terms of the covenant, that solidified this agreement, and they entered into a contract, if you will, that day by full agreement. Now, in the Old Testament, as it talks about this, it goes to great lengths to explain that there are many different sections of the law. There are the 10 Commandments, which we sometimes call the moral law. There are all kinds of laws about the temple and the priest and the sacrifices. Some people call those the ceremonial law. There were also a bunch of laws that would govern their civil life with one another and with their neighbors. Laws like how you establish boundary markers, and what do you do if somebody steals your property or violates your boundary and their cattle trample your barley or something. All of those things were included there because God is a God of order, and He's establishing His presence in all these different aspects of our life. He's not confined just to the ceremonial relationship, but God was part of all the aspects of their life. So there wasn't a separation between the daily and the holy. It was God throughout all parts of their lives. And that's how He calls us to live now in the new covenant as well. So among the people, God designated a specific group whose responsibility would be to carry out all of these offerings and sacrifices. Most of the people would be responsible for tilling the land, establishing government, doing the activities of citizens, and those people were the majority of the people in Israel. Now, we have talked about the bondage in Israel, and the people who were identified as the descendants of Abraham were the Jewish nation, and Israel was the reference to them as a people first. And they took their name, the people of Israel, from a forefather. In the Old Testament, there were lots and lots of different nations, but God called one man out of the nations, a man named Abraham, and said, I will make you the father of many nations, and I will bless those who bless you, I will curse those who curse you. So Abraham became the father of this nation that God was establishing to be a light to all the families of the earth. Abraham had a son named Isaac. Isaac had a son named Jacob, and it was through Jacob God said His promise concerning a descendant, the seed, who would finally come and bring relief from the consequence of sin would come. Those were the people then who were in bondage in Egypt. They were Abraham's descendants. And by the time that the descendants of Abraham moved to Egypt, there were only 75 of them that went there, and they were the sons of Abraham's grandson, Jacob. Abraham had Isaac, Isaac had Jacob. Jacob and his family ended up moving to Egypt. Jacob is the one whose name was changed to Israel. So God changed Jacob's name to Israel, and Israel the man had 12 sons. And those 12 sons each had children, and that was the original group that went to Egypt. By the time, 400 years later, that Moses is bringing them out of bondage, there are around 2 million men. Well, 600,000 men, and then about 2 million people total in the congregation. And they were the descendants of all these grandchildren of the man Jacob. His 12 sons had had all these children, and the children, the descendants, are often referred to as the 12 tribes of Israel, because those are all the descendants of Grandpa, Jacob. There were 4 sons who were born from Jacob's first wife, and then there were a bunch of sons from some concubines and from another wife and that sort of thing. But of this whole group, there was Reuben was the first son, Simeon was the second son, Levi was the third son, Judah was the fourth son, and then there were some other sons. Levi, the third son, was the ancestor of Moses. So 400 years had passed. Moses is the one bringing them out of bondage in Egypt. And God gives them all of these commands. And then God says, you're going to need someone specific who will have the responsibility of offering the sacrifices to cover the guilt of your sin. And Moses, you've got a different job. You're going to be busy with all the things I have for you. So I want you to ordain as the priest your brother Aaron. Aaron was Moses' older brother. They were both from the tribe of Levi, who was one of the 12 sons of Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel. Now you have to understand this little bit of the family tree in order to understand the priesthood that God then created. So we have the man Jacob, whose name is changed to Israel. So Israel was a man first. Israel had 12 sons. They were prolific and produced lots of children. Those children came to be known as the 12 tribes of Israel, each one named after one of the 12 sons. The third son was a man named Levi, and it was from his tribe that Moses had descended. But Moses was not picked by God to be the one who would head up the priestly offices. He had other jobs to do. And so Moses' brother Aaron was the first priest. And God designated him by God's own choice. And God said, Aaron and the sons of Aaron will be the priests. Not you, Moses, not Simeon or Reuben or anybody else's, Aaron's children. So it came to be known, the priesthood came to be described as of the family of Aaron from the tribe of Levi. That is the group to be the priests. And God was real serious about it. He was the one who chose it. There was even a big argument among the relatives about why can't the cousins be part of the priests? We should be able to be as holy because we're all sons of Israel. And God made his point by swallowing up in the earth the whole families of the cousins who complained about not having the priesthood. That's how seriously God viewed this. It was something called Korah's rebellion. So what we want to know from that is that God was serious about his selection of who and what group would be responsible for this job of performing the sacrifices and representing the people of Israel before God and God before the people of Israel. It was not something to be taken lightly. It was not something that was to be given to others outside the tribe of Levi and the family of Aaron. And the reason was because God said so. And he confirmed it numerous times that it was a matter of him setting the boundaries and that he was providing a way to have a relationship with him, but it had to be done in the way he prescribed. So Aaron, Moses' brother, was set apart and consecrated as the first priest. And he had his own sons to help him do this this job of making the sacrifices and offerings and teaching the people and ministering this part. This was the role of the priesthood. So therefore, because they were from the tribe of Levi, this priesthood was always called the Levitical priesthood. There are hundreds of references to the Levitical priesthood in the Old Testament. Only twice does it ever call it the Aaronic priesthood after Aaron. It was always called by Aaron's tribe, Levi. So this was known as the Levitical priesthood, and it was the only priesthood that was used there in Israel. The senior-most priest, in this case Aaron, was referred to as the high priest. And there was only one high priest at a time, because when a high priest died, then the next person in line became the high priest, and there was only one ever, and he served for his lifetime. And that was the process that God established. The others in the family of Aaron who qualified for the priesthood would help the high priest, and they would function as priests, but there was only ever one high priest at a time. They underwent rigorous training. Now, in the book of Exodus and in the book of Leviticus, we see the training and some of the requirements for the priesthood office, primarily the genealogical, that you're from the tribe of Levi and the family of Aaron. But then there were about 22 other requirements. They could not have any kind of physical defect, any mark or scar, any kind of blemish at all. They had to be perfect in limb and mind. They couldn't be suffering any kind of a skin eruption or outbreak. They had to be a perfect physical representation, because they were representing Israel to God, but they were also representing God to Israel. And so along with all of these physical requirements, they underwent a rigorous training that took until the man was 30 years of age. So a priest was trained until he was 30 years of age, and then he worked as the priest, doing the priestly activities, until he was about 50. And by the time he was 50, you're going to see in a few minutes that the priest's activity were highly physical. It was about slaughtering animals and cutting meat and placing it on the altar and flinging these heavy carcasses around. And so by the time men were 50, they were usually retired and returned to just assisting with these sorts of things. But nobody outside the tribe of Levi, the family of Aaron, ever served in this position. Of course, no woman ever served in this position. So along with the lineage and the requirements, the priests had particular clothing that they had to wear as they performed the different functions of their office. The regular priest would wear a white linen robe and a white linen undergarment under that robe, a white turban, and then a waistband of woven material that was red and blue. This is a picture of priests you can see in their linen clothing. And notice they're all barefoot because they were serving in a place of holy ground. So they did not wear shoes in that area. And I mentioned that they wore special undergarments. This is the kind of undergarment that they wore under their robe, because in this culture at this time, people didn't wear underwear. It wasn't practical, they didn't wear it. But God had told them specifically that they had to wear an undergarment when serving before the Lord. But all this clothing was left in the sanctuary after they finished their work each day. It wasn't their regular daily clothing. And so only in the sanctuary, as they did this ministry, did they wear these special clothing and robes. The high priest, however, had a special, several pieces of clothing that were unique to him to designate his role as the one who represents Israel as he goes in before God and represents God as he comes out to speak to the people. It included this white robe part underneath. But then over the top of that robe would be another robe, and you can see it a little bit in this photo, or in this sketch, it's this blue, it's almost like a bathrobe, a big bathrobe covering the white robe. That was called the blue ephod, E-P-H-O-D. And it was unique for the high priest. He wore the ephod. Then over the ephod, he wore a breastplate of righteousness. And could you see the breastplate? It was about this size. And across the top of the breastplate were a row of 3 gemstones, and there were 4 rows of gemstones. Going from right to left, these gemstones had the names of the 12 tribes inscribed on them. So when this was hanging on his chest, it was held by 2 golden chains and then fastened in the back with crisscross straps. And on the top, there would be an oval-shaped piece of black onyx, big like an epaulette, and it was what the shoulder piece was. And one shoulder piece would have 6 names inscribed on it, 6 of the tribes, and the other had the other 6 inscribed on it. So when he was dressed in the full regalia, you can see how he represented Israel. He carried Israel on his chest when he went in before God. And that was very symbolic and meaningful because he was the one chosen to go before God. The people, when they had heard the thunder and seen the lightning and all of the stuff on the mountain when God was meeting with Moses, were terrified by that. And they said, we don't want to talk to him. You talk to him for us. And so that's why they had a representative, because they didn't want to come into a personal relationship with God. And in the passages in the Old Testament that talk about the priestly clothing, it's the second row of references. It makes it clear as you read through the whole thing that these were left, not only the undergarments, but the gowns and all of the regalia of the high priest was always left in the sanctuary. It was not a part of their regular living. There were other insignia and things that were worn so that a high priest was known and recognized easily in the crowd, but these were ceremonial gowns, and that's all they were. So the clothing was very much to distinguish their role as representing God and reminding the people of this exalted position of mediator, but that it was still a position that a man who had sin held, because there was no perfect high priest. So when the high priest had to offer sacrifices, he had to offer sacrifices for his own sins first, and then he could serve in the role of representing the people. But he had to cover his own sins by sacrifice first. So when we think about the priesthood, it was always called Levitical, after the tribe of which Aaron was a part. And these various passages describe the selection of the priest and the consecration of the priest and the special clothing that the priest wore. Then I mentioned that the priest served in a special dwelling that was reserved just for this priestly activity. It was called the sanctuary, which means holy dwelling. When they were in the wilderness, when they got the 10 commandments and all the other commandments and all of these things about the priesthood and the sacrifices for the law, they were on their way somewhere else. So they needed a portable sanctuary because they were there in the Sinai Peninsula, but they were headed to Canaan. And so they needed to be able to move this portable sanctuary with them. And so the first sanctuary was portable. It was a tent, and it was called a tabernacle. Tabernacle means temporary dwelling. It means a tent. But it was built according to a very specific outline that God gave Moses when Moses met with him up on the mountain of Sinai. When they finally got into the promised land, which took them 40 years, they wandered around in the land, and then they only had this portable tent to do the worship activities that God had commanded. Because God had made it clear during their years in the wilderness that when they got to the promised land, they were not to build a permanent dwelling place until he showed them where he wanted it to be done. And so for 350 to 380 years after they came into the land, they just had this old stuff from the wilderness, the various pieces of the sanctuary. But finally, after they had been in the land about 400 years or more, God showed the people where he wanted the permanent dwelling place to be built. And through all this time, he had impressed upon them, don't build it any other place and don't offer any sacrifices any other place. You can't just do this up in Dan or down in Beersheba. You have to do it where I show you. And finally, God showed David, the shepherd boy who killed Goliath, but then became king in Israel. God showed David where he wanted the permanent dwelling place for the glory of God and the sacrifices to be built. And it was in the city that David had made his capital as king of Israel. It was the city of Jerusalem. And David purchased the land from a thresher guy who lived there, and David accumulated the materials to help with the building of the permanent sanctuary, but God would not allow David to build the structure itself because God said, David, you're a man of war. You have bloody hands, and my house is going to be a house of peace, a house of prayer, so you can't build it. But David's son, Solomon, built the permanent dwelling place, and when that dwelling place was constructed and finished and dedicated to God, the Shekinah glory fire came down from heaven and filled the permanent structure in exactly the same way it had done hundreds of years before in the wilderness when Moses had built the first portable structure and God's glory had filled that tabernacle in the wilderness. That was God's sign of approval that this is indeed the place. So in that sanctuary that Solomon built, it was built again exactly according to the pattern because God had said, see to it that you build my sanctuary according to the pattern that I gave you. So the portable one was the tabernacle. The permanent one was referred to as the temple. And once the temple was built, the tabernacle was gone. It had no purpose anymore, and it wasn't going to be portable anymore, and they only had one because God said so. He said, don't do this anyplace else, and do it in this city, in this sanctuary that I have designed. So on the back of your handouts, you have this sketch, and this is of the tabernacle. Solomon, who built the permanent structure, the temple, was a man given to excess, and so he increased everything by about 10 times. So it was much bigger than this, but this is the way that it looked in the wilderness. The sides were an open wall, so it was about maybe 10 to 12 feet tall, and it would be like a canvas wall all the way around. It wasn't canvas, it was made of different kinds of skins and weavings, but there was no roof over the top. And that was all the way around the perimeter of the area of the holy place. And there would be only one opening on the east side called the gate. When you went through that, the first thing that you came to was called the brazen altar. And in the brazen altar, at the brazen altar, is where the offerings were made. Now, we'll talk more about the offerings in just a few minutes, but it was here at the bronze altar that the offerings were made. After the offerings were completed, then the priests would go further in and they would cleanse at the bronze laver. When this structure was built in the wilderness, it was quite small. But when Solomon built his permanent sanctuary, the temple, he built this. It was so big, they called it the Sea of Brass. And it was set up on sculptures which Solomon had erected, and they were cattle or oxen, 3 on each side so that it made a square with this sea of brass on the top of it. But no one ever got into that because getting into it would defile the holy water. What they did was collect the water from the laver into an urn like this. And can you see the water taps or the taps on the urn? Then the water would be drained out and they would ceremonially wash their hands and their feet. But no one ever got into the laver because that would defile the whole thing. Besides that, this was a ceremonial cleansing. Only blood could cover the guilt of sin. This water and that blood part took place on the bronze altar. The water simply was a ceremonial cleansing of the blood that had covered the sin. And this process was done over and over and over again, every morning, every night, all day long, because sin never sleeps. And so people were bringing their sin offerings continually, and it was always the men who brought the offering because women weren't allowed to even enter this outdoor area inside the gate. No women were allowed through the gate. Only the men of Israel could come to the bronze altar bringing their sacrifices. So women couldn't come. They had to have their representative male take their offering when they had sinned. And that would have been their father or their husband or their brother or their son, whoever was the oldest male closest in relationship. So weddings were never performed here because the bride can't come. There were no women in the temple. The men of Israel were allowed here in the area of the altar because they actually brought their sacrifices and participated in that. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But the priests were the only ones who could go into the closed structure that was there inside this tall, open area. This area here, the rectangular looking area inside the courtyard, was a covered building. And it was covered with skins and weavings, so that this was the only part that had a roof over it, so it was dark inside. This part was called the holy place. Now, this labels the holy place down here, but the whole structure was called the holy place, and it was divided into 2 rooms. So this outer part was known also as the holy place. And inside this area, there were only 3 items. On the right-hand side, there was something called the table of showbread. And so that's represented right here. This golden thing was the table of showbread. And in the Old Testament, it's described as displaying 12 loaves of bread, representative of the 12 tribes of Israel and how God had fed them through that time. And it's a different picture than we might imagine. It's a vertical table. These are the priests carrying the unleavened bread. These are huge loaves of unleavened bread. And they are sliding them in. This is a double-sided vertical bread table. It reminds me a little bit of the ones that you see in bakeries, you know, how, or down at Costco where they have all the bread in those slots. That's how it was. And those huge unleavened bread loaves stayed there, and they were changed each week on the evening of the Sabbath. And that was in there representing, it was called the bread of the presence, and it was representing the 12 tribes of Israel before God and how he fed them and let them be in his presence in the time in the wilderness. On the other side, on the left-hand side as you're coming into the holy place, there was an enormous candlestick called a menorah. It looked like this, only it was huge. And in fact, they had to have a stepladder to go up and light the wicks on the menorah. And that was the only source of light here inside the holy place, was this huge menorah. And it had 7 branches to it. Sometimes when you go to Israel now, you'll find menorahs with 8 or even 9 branches. Those are Hanukkah menorahs, separate from the temple menorah, which has 7 branches. And this is what provided the light inside the holy place. When Solomon built his permanent structure, it was huge, so he put 10 of these in to light up the inside, but it was still the same kind of pattern that's intricately described in the Old Testament. The final thing that was in that area was something called the golden altar of incense. And this was a vertical, like a plant stand kind of shape thing with fire inside it and incense at the top. And the incense in there was kept in a special jar and then put on the fires when praying was going on. So here's a jar of the incense that the priest is holding, and they would take it in and throw that incense on this little plant stand looking kind of thing, brazier with coals, and the smoke would ascend, representing prayer. And those were the only things in that room. There was this back room which was never entered except once a year. The back room was called the Holy of Holies, or the Most Holy Place. The whole thing is called the Holy Place, but the back room is the Holy of Holies, or the Most Holy Place. No one ever went in there except once a year. I'll tell you more about that right now. So there was a dividing structure between the outer part here, the Holy Place, and the Holy of Holies. And that dividing barrier was the veil. See it here? The veil. When we say veil, we think of a bride veil, some sheer little thing like your grandmother's dining room curtains. But what it was a huge tapestry, like a triple woven tapestry. It was heavy, heavy, and very colorful. Now, this tapestry is a triple weave, so it's heavy, but not like what they had, because what they used was wool and linen, and then very, very, very thin strips of gold, which made it extremely heavy. And it was woven together. Now, mine have quail on it. The veil in the temple had cherubim, angels, woven into the texture. And it glittered in the candlelight. It must have been absolutely beautiful. But it was very, very heavy, and it was meant to keep everyone out. Once a year, one person would go behind that veil into the most holy place, and there was only one item in there, one piece of furniture, and it was something called the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant was like a cedar chest. You know what a cedar chest is? I don't know if they still even have them around very much, but it's a storage box that's maybe 3 feet by 2 feet, maybe a couple of feet high. And this storage box, this ark, was made of acacia wood and then covered with pure gold. And on top of it, if you think of putting a saddle on the top of a cedar chest, that's how it would kind of go. On top of the Ark of the Covenant, the box, was something called the mercy seat. So it's a sculpture of pure gold, one piece of beaten gold, and on it are 2 covering cherubs. They're facing each other, and their wings are spread, covering the seat, because this represents the glory throne of God. This is the mercy seat of God. And this is the only thing that was in the most holy place. Now, we know, because the New Testament tells us so, that all of these things in the sanctuary were a representation, and God was very specific that he wanted his design to be followed exactly, because all of these things in the sanctuary represented the real throne room in heaven. And this throne room, where the Ark of the Covenant and the mercy seat on top of it, was only used once a year, and that was by the high priest. Everything that went on out here every day all year long, and all the prayer and worship that went on here all year long, was performed by all of the priests. So by Jesus' time, there were so many priests, they had to draw straws and take turns and only do their priestly ministry maybe 2 weeks out of the whole year, because there were so many of them. But the one high priest was the only one who ever went into the Holy of Holies, and that was once a year on a day called Yom Kippur. We'll talk more about that in just a second. Now, this was the structure for the portable tabernacle, for the permanent temple. They never needed to have both at the same time, because the only purpose of this structure was to house the sacrifices and then the worship that would come after the sacrifices. It was not used for weddings, because the bride could not attend. The bride would not be allowed even into the outer court. It was not used for public gatherings. Those things happened in the perimeter around outside. So it was a special, set-apart, holy place, but only the identified Levitical priesthood could serve in this area. And the reason that they were set apart to do this is because the activity of offering sacrifices was highly detailed. There were lots and lots of things to learn and to know. The description of the sacrifices that were to be offered and how they were to be offered is in the first 7 chapters of the book of Leviticus. And when you go there and read it, it becomes confusing trying to keep track of what you do with this blood or that blood, and what you do with the entrails and what you do with the grain, and all of these kinds of things. And so God had set this apart as, this is your full-time job to know how to do this and to do it exactly. And there are a number of different kinds of offerings. There's a wine libation, there's a grain offering, there's a free will offering, a peace offering, a whole burnt offering. Many of those kinds of offerings, and they were brought by the people and then performed by the priests. But those offerings could never be given until sin was covered. So the blood offerings were the means which God had provided to cover the sin incurred when the law was broken. So remember when we started out, I was saying it was always these four things: the law, the priesthood, the sanctuary, and the sacrifices. They always go together. The law was given to make people distinct from those who don't know God, but it was also given so that the people who are in relationship with God know they have sin. And so they draw near to God for the help with sin. The help for sin God gave them was a priest who would offer the means to remain in relationship with God, a place where that offering would be offered, and then the offering itself. So these four things always went together. The sacrifices always began with a blood sacrifice, because what are the wages of sin? Death. And so there must be a blood offering. And the reason for this is given to us in Leviticus chapter 17. In Leviticus chapter 17 is explaining offerings that were previously in the same book enumerated and described. In Leviticus 17, it says this: when you are offering the blood, and see to it that no one eats of the blood, for, verse 11, the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you on the altar to make atonement for your souls. For it is the blood by reason of the life that makes atonement. Now, what that's saying is that, okay, the wages of sin is death. Remember when God gave the command in the garden, he told the man and the woman, the day that you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will surely die. And the day that they ate, what happened? They died spiritually, which is to be separated in relationship with God. That happened right that day when they were driven out of his presence in the garden. And then it involved physical separation, the soul separated from the body. That began that day, and then each one of those people died, and everybody else has died since then. So we've all experienced the consequence of sin, but God is saying that the consequence of breaking his law can be covered over. The word atonement is from the Hebrew word kippur, or kippurim is the plural, and it means covering. And that's what this verse says, that a covering of your guilt can be provided if a substitute bears the consequence of your sin. Remember, that's what God had done as he sent Adam and Eve out of his presence in the garden. Remember in Genesis 3, verse 20, God takes an animal and kills the animal, sheds its blood, and covers the people with the skin from that animal. And that covers the guilt of their sin in God's sight. What had they done to cover their sin? The fig leaves. But God said, no, your covering isn't sufficient. My covering is what is needed. And he sacrificed the animal, a blood sacrifice, an innocent substitute sacrificed to cover the guilt of those who have sinned. And that's exactly what this blood sacrifice is. It paralleled exactly what God had done to cover that very first sin. And so God is explaining that it's by reason of the life that's in the blood. If I were to make a sacrifice and only allow the sacrifice to bleed and then not die, would that bear the consequence of sin? No, because what is the consequence of sin? Death, not just blood, but death. And even the Hebrews knew in their ancient civilization, without microscopes, without an understanding of blood cells and oxygen saturation, that if you lost all your blood, you were dead. And so God tells them it's by reason of the life that's in the blood that the sacrifice is acceptable, because someone else, something else, this substitute sacrifice, is bearing the consequence. So one of the restrictions of those laws is that they not eat meat that still had the blood in it, because that was representative of life. So he says in verse 14, For as for the life of all flesh, its blood is identified with its life. Therefore you are not to eat the blood of any flesh, for the life of all flesh is its blood. Whoever eats it shall be cut off. So in this offering, what God is saying is that this covering or atonement covers the guilt that the people incurred when they broke the law. The priest has to offer that sacrifice, which brings covering, and it has to be offered the way God said in the sanctuary that represents his dwelling place. So it has to be in this special building. But it's the sacrifice itself that brings the covering of sin. So when the sacrifice was offered, they offered a blood sacrifice every morning and every night. And then people would come with their sacrifices before the whole congregation. They would come with their sacrifice, and from the sacrifice brought, you could figure out what their sin had been. It was a form of public confession, because every time you came with your sacrifice, what were you saying? I did it again, and here I am with my sacrifice. And on Yom Kippur, which was called the Yom Kippur is the Day of Atonement. Once a year, the high priest would do this sacrifice in a representative way as he represented the whole nation of Israel before God. And he would wear all of his priestly regalia, and with the breastplate on and the ephod on and his robe. And you see this big turban on his head. It has a gold bar across which says, Holy to the Lord. There were all these beautiful things in his vestments. But before he could begin functioning as the high priest that day, he had to take a bull to the bronze altar and sacrifice that bull for himself because he was a sinner. And then he had to take the blood of that sacrifice, and in an orderly ritual, he would take that blood through the holy place. He would go behind the veil into the Holy of Holies, and the high priest on the day of Yom Kippur was the only one who ever entered this part of the sanctuary. And he would anoint that mercy seat with the blood of the bull that represented him. And he had to do that before he could serve on behalf of the people. Once that had been done, then he came back out, and they would draw lots or shake lots for the animal to be sacrificed. This is a lot box here, and it was just it contained 2 pieces of wood, and they would shake it out of this box onto the ground or a table or something, and it would determine what would happen to which of the 2 goats they had would become the sacrifice. Because after the priest offered the bull for his own sacrifice, then 2 goats would be brought before him. They would do this throwing of lots that would designate one for the Lord and one for Azazel. The one for the Lord was the goat that was sacrificed. But before the goat was sacrificed, the priest would lay his hands on the head of that goat, and he would confess the sins of Israel. After that, the neck would be slit, and the blood would be collected from the goat for the Lord. And that blood would be taken by the high priest through the outer court, through the holy place, behind the veil, and that blood would be anointed on the mercy seat to cover the sin of the people of Israel. Then he would come out one more time, and the other goat, the one that's still alive, was called the scapegoat. And he would place his hands on the scapegoat and again confess all the sins of Israel on the head of this goat. And then that goat would be driven out of their presence outside the city. And you see the symbolism there? It took two goats to give the symbolism of the covering of sin. The consequence, which was the goat that was sacrificed and the blood taken in. And that covers the sin. But then driving the scapegoat out of their midst is the removal of sin from their presence so that they can be holy once more and remain in relationship with the holy God. And this was done every year, year in and year out. They had to have this sanctuary in this place. And without the sanctuary in this place, these sacrifices could not be performed. The blood sacrifices had to be given first because you cannot draw near to worship a holy God unless sin is dealt with. In the Old Covenant, the way that God said to deal with sin was to cover it with the blood of a substitute sacrifice to make atonement. And so if they could not follow those commands, then they could not bring the rest of their offerings, like the whole burnt offering or a peace offering or a thank offering. Those were the kinds of offerings that were done with the grain and the wine and the oil, sometimes a whole burnt offering offered on the altar, which was a great praise and thanksgiving to God. The people could not draw near to worship unless their sin was covered. Now, God had said to the people, you cannot do this anywhere except the sanctuary, except in the building built on the place I show you. That temple was built in about 930 BC by Solomon. So there was no more tabernacle. All of this was carried out at that location. But the people did not obey God. And remember, it was an if-then kind of agreement, a conditional covenant. And God had said, if you obey me, I will bless you all over the place. But if you don't, I will give you curses and consequences. And part of that consequence was that God told them if they persisted in wickedness and unrepentance, he would tear them out of the land. They persisted, and first in 605 BC, then in 597 BC, and then finally again in 586 BC, the Babylonians showed up at their front door and tore them out of the land, took them captive into Babylon and tore down the temple. When God moved empires and rulers around so that Babylon was no more and Persia was the world ruler, the Persian king Cyrus released the Jewish prisoners of war in Babylon, and they returned to the land. And it took a number of years to rebuild the temple, but they rebuilt the second temple in exactly the place where the first temple had been built. The first temple was built there in Jerusalem by Solomon. It was torn down by the Babylonians, so the second temple was built by Zerubbabel. It was completed in 516 BC and rededicated. It never had the Shekinah glory of God enter into it. But that was the temple that was in existence when Jesus came. Now that temple, when it was first built and completed in 516 BC, was a sad little shack compared to the place that Solomon had built. But over the centuries, it had been refurbished and worked on, and one of the main people to refurbish it was Herod the Great. And Herod the Great, the bad guy in the New Testament, had spent 46 years building it and making it a beautiful, beautiful place. And that was the place where Jesus took his offerings. That's where his mother and father took him when he was a little baby, 40 days old, for his purification. After the death of Jesus, just before the death of Jesus, Jesus made a prophecy that Jerusalem and all that was in it, including the temple, would be cast down and torn apart without one stone being left upon another. And he said the reason for that would be because they did not recognize the time of their visitation. He was talking about them not realizing that he was the Messiah they had been waiting for. But they crucified him. The resurrection occurred. Jesus returned, sent the Holy Spirit. The church began to grow. But the Jews continued to make sacrifices in the temple. Now, how do you think God felt about the covering of an animal's blood? If Jesus is the Lamb of God, do we need all of those other sacrifices? In fact, they're an insult. And so in 70 AD, God allowed the Roman general Titus to enter Jerusalem and utterly destroy it, leaving not one stone upon another. And they utterly destroyed the second temple. And they took much of the booty from it, much of the treasure to Rome. And there's even an arch built in Rome called the Titus Arch that shows the menorah and some of the silver trumpets being carted off by the Roman soldiers. And from that day on, there has never been another temple. And for these hundreds of years, Jews have not even been allowed in the city of Jerusalem. After the second uprising in 134 AD that the Jews did against the Romans, the Jews were scattered from that area and were never allowed again in that part of what was called Palestine at the time. And it wasn't until the late 19th century when Theodor Herzl, a Russian Jew who had a vision of rebuilding Zion in Palestine or Israel, began to buy land and provide funds to send people, Jews, back to the land of Israel. That's the first time Jews had been there in hundreds of years. And then, of course, with the war between the Palestinians and the Jews that resulted in a free Israeli state, there suddenly was another Jewish nation of Israel, where there had not been a nation of Israel for nearly 2,000 years. Almost overnight, suddenly there's Israel again. But in those ensuing centuries, a different house of worship had been built on the Temple Mount, and that's where the Al-Aqsa Mosque stands today. And, of course, that is the third most holy site in Islam. Muslims and Jews are bitter enemies, as you're probably aware, and Jews do not even go on the Temple Mount. But they stand outside the ruins on the western side of the wall, which would be this side up here. This would be west, this would be east, north, and south. And to this day, right now, there are Jews standing along that wall wailing and beating their heads against the stones because they have no place to offer sacrifice. And that's why they call the Western Wall the Wailing Wall. Have you ever heard of the Wailing Wall? That's why they wail, because they know they cannot offer sacrifice. And they understand the Old Covenant description of how that separates them from their God. And it's one of the most tragic things I've ever seen. When I was there the first time, it just haunted me for weeks. People wailing and weeping and beating their heads till they're bloody because they can't offer sacrifice to draw near to God. And I wanted to say, read the Bible, read Hebrews. There is no more sacrifice when sin is forgiven. But they understand the concept that they have to have covering for their guilt. They just have missed the Lamb of God, who is the covering. Now, next week, we will talk about what the New Testament passages say concerning God's provision for covering sin. And it's much more than simply covering sin. Now, we read that passage about making atonement by the covering of the blood. It didn't say anything about taking the sin away. It didn't say anything about changing our heart so that we wouldn't continually sin. There were no such promises. And this was a highly conditional arrangement, but it still shows us the grace of God, because God knew that they wouldn't be able to keep all that law. So in almost the same breath that he gave all those commandments, he also gave them the means of the priesthood and the sanctuary and the sacrifices so that they could stay in relationship with him, a holy God. So the law is knit together with these three other pieces, and they all go together. If we aren't bound by the law, then do we need the other pieces? What we're going to see is the answer to that next week. The fulfillment of the Old Covenant is seen in Jesus. In the New Testament, we see Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, and he makes it very clear that the Word of God endures forever. But when God's Word, its purpose is fulfilled, its meaning is fulfilled, when it is completed, then that brings it to resolution. And in Matthew chapter 5, it's verses 16 and 17. No, verse 17 and 18, excuse me. Matthew 5, 17 and 18. Do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass from the law until all is accomplished. Now, what is the difference between abolish and fulfill? That's at the heart of the question here about what has happened to the law. What role does it play today since Jesus came and fulfilled it? That's partly what we're going to be looking at. Well, that's essentially what we're going to be looking at next week. But what God had provided was a means of covering sin for a limited period of time. But God had also made some promises. Remember how I told you the Babylonians came 3 times, and finally they completely destroyed Jerusalem? Well, during that time, God had sent them warnings through the prophets, Jeremiah and Ezekiel, warning them to return to God, repent. And finally, God changed the message. He didn't say repent anymore. He said, time's up and you're going to get it. But he sent them a promise of hope, saying that one day there would be a new covenant, different from the one that they had broken, the one that he made with their fathers when he took them by the hand and led them out of Egypt. What he was talking about was this covenant. The new covenant would be different from this one. And so that's what we're going to look at next week.